Well, welcome back to another episode of A Different Door. I recently saw on Facebook that we had crossed 100 episodes. It doesn't seem like we have been doing that for this long, but I guess so.
We have indeed been doing this.
It really adds up. So.
I feel every episode.
Oh, man. Well, we have a little bit of an optimistic, pessimistic vibe going on today. I don't know. But we are in the second week of our In Good Faith sermon series. So last week we talked about legacy. This week we are talking about trust. And this morning we are in Psalm 23, a pretty familiar one, but here it goes. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. I would venture to guess that most of us have maybe heard this passage before, but it's interesting set in the context of trust. So as we begin to think about this idea of trust in this passage, where do you see the overlap?
Yeah, I think it is so interesting because I really feel like you should read Psalm 22, 23, and 24 as a set. And last week we were in Psalm 22, and in the midst of it we saw the author, typically attributed to David, struggling. He was struggling with everything. He's deeply in sorrow. He's disconnected from his community. He feels like God has abandoned him. And what he's trying to remind himself of is God has been faithful to my ancestors, to everybody over time. But I don't feel like God's there for me. And yet immediately juxtaposed to that sorrow, to that feeling of abandonment, to that feeling of, well, there is no God here for me. God may be for other people, but God is not here for me. You get to Psalm 23, and in it, there is this just absolute trust that, yes, there's going to be things, there's going to be trials, there's going to be tribulations, there's going to be challenges, but guess what? Surely, goodness and mercy will be with me, and God will be with me all of my days. And so there's a trust there that has come out of the authorship. There's something that has happened, or maybe just trying to remind himself of what to expect, where we're going, where we're headed, and we hold on to it. It's only 6 verses, and yet we see it everywhere. And I think that's because Psalm 23 has such an impact just on, if you could go, okay, well, somebody just tell me like what you expect out of God. Well, here's Psalm 23. I think it's really helpful just in an understanding of what God is like. We attribute David to being a shepherd or a sheep herder.
Yeah.
So this is from somebody who knows what God is like. God is like a shepherd. And it's really interesting, the juxtaposition, especially in regards to Psalm 22.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I see trust kind of pop out to me in these words: leads me, restores me, puts me back on the right path. Because for me, when I start to feel like David, so you talked about how we kind of take these Psalms in conjunction with one another, and I ask myself, how often have I been there? How often have I been in that place where I'm like, God, do you even see me right now? Do you care? Do you see what I'm going through? I've noticed recently that one of the times where I feel like this the most is after a very overwhelming week, when I plan out a little section of time where I think, okay, I'm going to carve out this moment and I'm going to work on whatever my current sewing project is. And I feel like week after week here recently, that time ends up getting taken by something else. There's something that comes up that someone else needs. And I found myself this week in that space where I was sort of asking God, like David, do you even care about me? There's been a lot this week, right? There's been a lot that's popped up in the wake of the election. And I think when I hear he leads me, He restores me. That is a centering place for me that brings me back to trust in the middle of sort of this frustration of feeling like things aren't going how I planned or how I wanted.
We're living in the unknown. One of the things that keeps popping up for me this week, and it's probably because I told this particular story so much. I used to use it in my confirmation sermons. As a youth director, you get to preach the confirmation service. And with Veterans Day approaching, I think it also has just been kind of tumbling around in my brain. But it's that, do you know what it means to sail under sealed orders?
Well, I cheated because I read your notes, but I did not know what sailing under sealed orders meant before this week.
Yeah, so if you didn't cheat and look at my notes, some of you who are in the Navy maybe know what that means. But basically, there is a ship that is at dock. And I always like to imagine that it's at midnight because it feels, more mysterious that way. But the crew's completely ready to sail. Everybody's on board. They're in position. They're all ready to sail. They're just waiting for their orders. And suddenly, an envelope will come to the captain who's on the bridge of the ship, and that envelope is completely sealed. And the captain knows that inside that envelope are the ship's orders, where they're supposed to go. In it will be the details of the mission and the destination. But stamped on the front of that envelope will be the words, sailing under sealed orders. And printed on the outside of that envelope will be coordinates, latitude and longitude. It'll just be a place in the middle of the ocean for which they are to sail. And for the sake of their military secrecy, the captain has been trained not to open that envelope until they get to that spot in the middle of the ocean. And so the ship will set sail, going it knows not where, to do it knows not what, but trusting in headquarters, trusting that the people in charge know what they're doing and are sending them where they need to be. And when they finally do get to that space, the captain will open up the envelope and then will discover their destination and their mission. And I think in a sense, the Christian faith is like that.
Isn't it?
We don't know what we're being called to a lot of the times. We are sailing, so to speak, under sealed orders. And we have to trust that God is leading us to the next step. I think we see this from David, from Psalm 22, where he doesn't know what anything's about. He's struggling. He is trying to find his purpose. He feels disconnected from community, and yet he's trusting in headquarters. He's trusting in God that he's going to end up where he needs to be. And we see that then manifest in Psalm 23, where he goes, the Lord is my shepherd. Mm-hmm. I lack nothing. And I think when you get to Psalm 23, David's opened the envelope. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. David has a renewed sense of purpose, a renewed sense of mission. His trust is back. Mm-hmm. And in that, you get those words, which is a totally different juxtaposition from where we were.
Yeah, and I think you kind of feel like this gratitude from David pouring out. And when we think about this idea, after I had read that, sailing under sealed orders, I thought, oh my, like this would not be the situation for me. And I think it depends on what type of person you are. If you're the type of person that thrives on planning and knowing exactly what is coming, then this idea of trust becomes a lot harder. I love the people that can kind of get lost in stuff and forget things. It was fun because there was somebody on my lay covenant committee that they got busy grilling out and they just kind of forgot about the meeting. And he was apologetic. I'm so sorry that I missed the meeting. And I thought, you went where the night took you. Like, I am so happy for you and so happy that you were able to do this. But I think depending on what type of person we are, this idea of trusting and feeling like you are going to a destination that you don't know, which if we're honest with ourselves, every single one of us are. We don't know what's coming up. We can plan, like I was saying, we can plan and we can set aside our time and we can carve it out just right, but that doesn't mean that it's going to happen like that. And I think something that really jumps out to me in this passage when David is sort of, again, like I said, pouring out his gratitude for God, for who God is and what God has done, is David says, you prepare. Mm-hmm. You prepare a table before me. Not, I prepared it and you showed up there. You prepared it. And I think for people like me where it's really hard to feel like there's something coming down the pike and you don't know what it is, you prepare.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part about that too is, especially when we put it in the current context, we have, all of us, been a part of an election. We all chose how we were going to participate and what our part was going to be. And then now we have watched a whole lot of things unfold on social media that even 20 years ago we didn't watch unfold,
Right.
which is the interactions that we have with one another, which frankly, for the most part, are not very Christian
Yeah.
and not very kind. And I think part of that is we've got a whole lot of feelings in the
Yeah.
midst of it, rightly so. But the other part of it, I think, too, is what we are seeing play out now is something that's been playing out for a really long time, and that is that we have lost the ability to trust one another. I think Vaughn's song was so apt because what he was trying to remind us of is that we actually do care for one another.
That's right.
And yet there is this thing that's been lost in translation. And the thing that's been lost in translation is we don't know how to be in community anymore.
That's right.
And the reason we don't, everyone's trying to pinpoint, well, why don't we know how to be in community anymore? Why don't we? And people are like, well, you're going to have to go ask your neighbor for sugar because Amazon can get it there in 2 hours or less, right?
Sure.
You just order your sugar. And the other piece of it is we have become so anxious and fearful
That's right.
of our neighbors
That's right.
that we don't know how to interact anymore. You did a study with your coffee talk group
Yeah.
around the book The Anxious Generation.
Yes.
And they talked about that disconnect. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I think that this is a really interesting thing. So this book, if you haven't picked it up yet, it's called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. He's a professor at New York University, a social psychologist, and it is jam-packed with thought-provoking, wise ideas. But one of the things that he talked about was how there was a time when I was a kid, and probably when many of you were kids, where you would just go out and run the neighborhood. You would do whatever you wanted with your friends, and it was great and it was fine, because there were a bunch of parents that were kind of still out and about. So Sally's mom might be out there watering her lawn, and if she saw somebody throwing a rock at a car, Sally's mom would be the first one to say, Jimmy, whether it was her kid or not, we don't throw rocks at cars. We don't do that. But this day and age, we don't do that sort of thing because we've lost trust in one another. So for example, if Sally's mom goes out and yells at little Jimmy, and then little Jimmy goes and tells his mom, well, Sally's mom said, yelled at me or said this, well, then Sally's mom is fearful of retaliation. We don't work in cooperation the way that we used to. And there are many reasons for that. But one of the reasons that Jonathan Haidt suggested that we've lost this trust in others is because at all times, in every moment, we know every untrustworthy act that everyone has done all over the world. And so you read about a man in Oregon that did something terrible to some girls at a sleepover, and then you assume that your neighbor will or is very, very likely to do the exact same thing. And so with all of this information that we are able to hold and carry at one time, or that we are kind of served, I don't know if we're able to handle it, we're served it, it's caused this interesting break in that we sort of, for lack of a better way of saying it, assume the worst about our neighbors. Where in a prior time we might say, Sally's mom only said that because she didn't want Jimmy to damage the car and then get in trouble with its owners. That's the only reason she yelled out from her yard. Whereas now it might be like, well, Sally's mom is extremely self-righteous and thinks that she knows. And again, that's assuming the worst about Sally's mom.
Or you'll never know it was Sally's mom. You'll just think it was neighbor 572 who posted the Ring camera footage of kids running through their yard, right?
Sure.
I'm so glad I grew up in a time period without Ring cameras.
Yeah.
Not because I was a bad kid, okay? But we did things that now we'd be all over the Ring cameras.
Yeah.
I was at my friend Ian's house one time, and we played hide and go seek, the tag version, all over the neighborhood, hopping fences and running through people's yards, right?
Sure.
If my kid did that now, I'd be mortified and also worried that he was going to be injured, right?
Sure.
So there's a whole level of, you talk about the anxious generation and the running, we don't do it anymore.
Right, and that lack of being able to trust our neighbor, this social psychologist proposes that contributes to the anxiety that not only our kids are having, but us too. Again, we assume the worst, and it causes this kind of terror that we have about the world and interacting with the world because we feel like no one's safe and nothing's safe. And how can you be calm and relaxed in a world like that?
Yeah. Also, my mom is here today. She just found out I ran the neighborhood and into people's yards, and she's wondering, like, why did I ever let him go over to his house? But I think that's the challenge, right? When we talk about trust, right? We've lost trust in one another. And because of that, when we're assuming the worst instead of the best, we lose sight of one of the best things that Jesus teaches us. And that is when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, what he's also saying is you got to have an inherent trust in your neighbor. And that's so hard because now we can get online and we can see some of the things that our neighbor is saying and we can go, well, was right about that, block. Right? We can go, oh, this is not going to be safe, block. And what the challenge with that is, right? And I'm not saying it's a negative thing to block people who are harming you, if that's what you need to do. One of the things that David says here is, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. But what David is willing to do, because David trusts God, is he's willing to go to the table.
Yeah.
And I think because we have so lost sight of trust in one another, and we've really lost sight of a trust in God, we don't want to sail under sealed orders. We want all of our orders hand-delivered in bright packaging, and we want the orders that are delivered to be the ones that we prayed for. And because of that, we don't want to go to the table.
That's right.
And if we're not willing to go to the table, there's no transformation.
That's right.
And I think that's the biggest challenge. And we all know champions in our lives who are always willing to go to the table. And yet each of us is called to go in some way. And we know that when we do, our cup overflows. But I think that's the challenge because we go, I don't want to go to the table with people I know are going to harm me. I don't want to go to the table with bigots. I don't want to go to the table with fill in the blank. And yet, one of the things that David says is, I can go because I trust God. How do we get to a level of trust in God like David has?
Yeah, I think that there's this question in my mind when I think about this. Number one, God has prepared. God has prepared the table. And then we don't know what's going to happen in the presence of our enemies. But I think this question, this hopeful question that kind of rises up in me is, what's there? What's possible in that space that God has prepared? Because one thing that I know about God, that I feel like I have seen over and over and over again in my faith journey, is God is so much bigger and so much more gracious and so much more merciful every time than what I expected, than what I could have prepared, than the orders that I could have written in that envelope and sealed up for myself. And so I think as we move into this trust or this idea of trusting, we ask ourselves, what's there? Because we know how big our God is. God has showed us again and again how big God loves and how beyond our own limited imagination, God can bring healing and restoration. I've seen it before in my own life. So I think that's where we are today. Okay, if we trust and we bring ourselves to the table, what can happen?
Yeah, and I think the challenge too in this is that the scriptures say, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right, I shall fear no evil. It doesn't say we shall not face any evil.
That's right.
Right? It just says we shouldn't fear it. Ralph Sockman has a great quote where he says, a grief is a sorrow we carry in our heart, and a grievance is a chip we carry on our shoulder. And so often we are carrying a lot of chips on our shoulders of, well, people should have done this, or we should have done that, or how do we even get here, or people are just dumb, or people are ignorant, or what are you even doing with your life? Right? And we think about that. We think about that about our family members and our friends and our neighbors and our coworkers, right? We all have a grievance against a coworker, every one of us. Mine's not against you. I know your brain is, girls, is it me? No. But we all face these challenges. We face trouble. It's a universal impartial thing that none of us are immune to. We're going to face challenges. There is no wall that we could build that is high enough to shut out all the troubles of life. No matter how sheltered or protected we feel like we are, no matter how sheltered or protected we try to help our children, there is no trick, however clever, that we can evade it. Sometimes, and in some place, in the way we least expect it, we're going to face challenges and trouble and hurt. The question is, how are we going to respond to it? And I think one of the things that we hear here in the psalm, right, that David is trying to help us lean into is the best response we can have is, do you trust the shepherd? Do you trust that God is going to lead you? Do you trust that in the midst of adversity, God is going to be with you? Do you trust that no matter what you're going through, even if you're heading to a table and your enemies are there, that the table prepared is going to ultimately lead to good? And I think the hard part, the biggest challenge, right, is what do we do with that? How do we lean into that? Because we know David struggled with that. We saw that in Psalm 22. David's like, I've been abandoned, God's not there. And then for whatever reason, he got to a different place, in a different space. How do we do that too?
Yeah, I think one of it goes back, one thing that we could do goes back to that kind of idea that we were talking about with the kids out in the neighborhood. I think assuming the best of someone until proven otherwise is the best that we can possibly offer. So when you gave the quote about the grievance being the chip on our shoulder, the question that came up in my mind is, do we really want to be like that? Do we really want to be people that walk around with this angry chip on our shoulder and are mad all the time and are constantly just weighed down is the word that I can think of? Because I think in that weight, in that anger, if that's constantly the thing that's on your shoulder and therefore in your ear and coming out of your mouth, that leads to some places into some unchristlike behaviors that I think we don't want to do. And so I think to the extent that we offer the most gracious interpretation possible, that's a place of starting with our relationship with other people. And then I also think for me, the reminder of He leads, He restores, God repairs. Reminding myself of those things, that God is the shepherd. There isn't a political person out there that is going to come in and be the kind of shepherd that God is. These are human beings we're talking about, and God is God.
Yeah, and I think the biggest piece, I think you've said it exactly right, is that challenge of do we know the shepherd? Do we know and we trust God? One of my favorite stories of all time is about a priest who was celebrating his 50th year of ordination. And in that celebration, they had invited a renowned speaker to come in and just give an elaborate performance. He was a wonderful orator, could always hold a room, in the palm of his hand when he spoke. Everybody listened. And he gave this beautiful, beautiful performance, and everybody clapped, but he always ended, when he came back after his standing ovation, with reciting Psalm 23. And as he recited it, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Everybody just held their breath. It was beautiful. And again, after he finished, everybody stood up and clapped. And this man who had been invited said, we're here actually to celebrate my friend, this priest. I'd like to invite him up. Would you recite Psalm 23 for us? And so he came and he began to recite the 23rd Psalm. And as he did, everyone in the room began to weep. And you could just feel the emotion that poured through. And afterwards, somebody who was in the audience came up to this renowned speaker and said, when you spoke, we were all there. It was wonderful. We gave you a standing ovation. But we were so moved by this priest. He goes, why do you think that is? And he simply responded. He said, I know the psalm. He knows the shepherd. And I think what we see in this difference between the David of Psalm 22 and the David of Psalm 23 is he knows the shepherd now. He trusts God in a different way now. And no matter the circumstances that he finds himself in, he knows that God is going to lead, God is going to restore, and God is going to move us through whatever is going on. Because he knows the shepherd. Amen. And I think the greatest hope is that no matter what we are going through, that we can trust in God. No matter what our worries are, that we can trust in God. No matter what our sins are, we can trust in God. We can bring everything to God, and we can trust that God's going to help us. Because like David, we are learning to trust the shepherd.
Amen.